Hello, I'm Carlo Gébler, and I'm here today on behalf of the Irish Cultural Centre in Hammersmith, London. As part of its remit, the Centre provides a platform for Irish authors to launch, promote, and discuss their work. The ICC's inaugural Literary Festival in autumn 2020, of which I was a part, showcased a number of Irish writers from all parts of Ireland, from Canada, and from America. This slightly shorter series is going to focus specifically on leading voices and writers from Northern Ireland. I am pleased to be launching the series with someone whom I believe, needs very little by way of introduction. Mary McAleese, legal counsel, activist, politician, Doctor of Canon Law, President of Ireland, writer. Her memoir, Here's the Story, will form the basis of our discussion, but I'm sure we will talk about other things, including what is happening as we speak, which is the inauguration of President Biden. There was a Freudian slip. Okay, the first thing I want to do, just so that people can understand a bit about the earth, the humus from which you sprung. You are a confluence of County Down and County Roscommon. You've got these two strains. Just tell us in a very truncated form where your forebears came from and how they ended up in Belfast.
Well, they were country people, and like a lot of country people my father was from a very small farm in County Roscommon, subsistence farm in North County Roscommon, between the towns of Carrick-on-Shannon and Boyle. And he left there at 14 to seek his fortune in Belfast, where his three aunts had gone to seek work. One of them, the mother of a man very strongly associated with the place called the Irish Cultural Centre. That's Jim O'Hara. And you probably know Jim, of course, from the centre. And so he came from rural Roscommon to Belfast to work as an apprentice barman. My mother, her people were County Down sheep farmers who had gone to the city. My grandfather had been in the old IRA, and so that hadn't gone down very well in the area that he was from in County Down, or indeed with his parents. So he and my grandmother made their lives away from their farm, their family farm in County Down, up at the top of Slieve Croob, where the Lagan rises. And they came and they lived in Belfast. In fact, my mum originally was born in the town of Mahara in Derry. That's where he got work there as a bread server with Barney Hughes's bakery. And then he moved to Ardoyne. And what brought them to Ardoyne was really almost ignorance in a way. They didn't know Belfast. They didn't know anything much about it. And they hadn't very much money, but there were houses available in Ardoyne because nobody really else wanted to live there. It was a sectarian quagmire even then. And so they brought their small family there, and the family grew to 11. And my mum became an apprentice hairdresser to one of my father's aunts who had come from Roscommon, set up a little business just opposite Ardoyne Chapel. And that's how he met my mum, and how I ended up being born and reared in Ardoyne.
You lived in many different households in that area.
Well, there were not. What happened? My mum and dad started out, just with the two of them in one room in somebody else's house. They were tenants in somebody else's house, lodgers, you may say. And then one after another, rather rapidly, my mum got married she was married at 19. She had me at 20. And by the time she was 38, she'd had 11 pregnancies and 9 live children. So as the family got bigger, we moved, and we never moved very far. You could have thrown a stone from the house that we left to the house we were going to. The only difference was that the houses were just a little bit bigger each time to accommodate the growing clan.
And one of those houses, which it establishes threads that reappear all the way through the book, was on the Woodvale Road.
That's right. The top of the Shankill Road.
Which is at the top of the Shankill.
As you know, the Woodvale Road is an extension of the Shankill Road. Actually, Jim that lived there too, Jim O'Hara. Jim was born and raised just a few doors up from me. It was by and large a Protestant area, but we were one of very few Catholics who lived there. We just literally at the back of the chapel, the back wall of our Ardowing chapel, the long, big granite wall of the chapel was what we could see really from our house, it was right across the road from us. And so that's where I lived, at the top of the Shankill Road. The Shankill Road was, for us growing up, in those days, although now, of course, associated really strongly with loyalism, and even then, nonetheless, it was our hinterland, you know, for shopping and for just our community. It was our community growing up. And I thought nothing of, because most of my friends growing up were Protestant, apart from my school friends, because I went to Catholic schools. But outside of school, my friends were all Protestant. So I would meander down the Shankill Road with my friend Florence, and we would meander into the Reverend Sidney Callahan's church, Protestant minister, a great, wonderful character, who eventually married her when she married a Scottish soldier in Theatville Barracks in Lisburn. And let me tell you, for Catholic girls, my sister was her bridesmaid, all my family were at that wedding. It wasn't a very safe thing to be doing in those days in our Ardowing, for Ardowing Catholics, to be going, you know, to have much to do with Scottish soldiers, and in particular their weddings. You could have got tarred and feathered for a lot less, and that would have been, of course, by supporters of the IRA, if not the IRA itself. You know, there were all those kind of ongoing tensions that we didn't pass too much remarks on. They were part of the wallpaper, if you like, growing up.
The Woodvale house, you had some neighbours whose names I'll return to later. The Shaws and the O'Reillys. The Shaws lived next door to you, and they were.
No, the Shaws actually lived next door to the O'Reillys.
Oh,
but they lived
next door.
Just a few doors up from us. We were houses with no houses facing us, a long terrace of houses, and we were just a few doors from the Shaws. They were the most lovely family, Plymouth Brethren, and their daughters and their sons were in and out of our house all the time, as we were in and out of their house. They were great friends. When their daughter Anna got married, my sister was also her bridesmaid. One of my other sisters, Kate, was her bridesmaid. And they very generously, kindly bought her a beautiful white dress, knowing that she'd be coming up to her first communion, and that dress would also do her first communion. So that was the kind of, you know, lovely generosity there was. Rather regrettably, their son joined a loyalist paramilitary organization and went out one night in the early 1970s and murdered 5 people. 4 of them were Catholics, just random. These were all random killings, including a young girl who was just serving petrol in a petrol station. But the 5th person they killed very close to our home on the other side of the chapel, what we would call the front side. We were on the Woodvale Road side, but the chapel was at the apex of 2 roads, the Crumlin Road and the Woodvale Road. And on the Crumlin Road side, where the main entrance to the chapel was, they killed a man who was walking past that entrance. And that poor man was a Protestant man on his way to work, but they presumed because he was close to the chapel, they thought he was Catholic. And my cousin, and also Jim's cousin, Jim O'Hara's cousin, the guy called Paddy Cassidy, Paddy had a little newsagent right across the street, and he ran out and was the first on the scene when that poor man died. And he too initially made the same mistake. He thought he was a Catholic, and he did what Catholics do, you know, they whisper the act of contrition. And the death traumatized Paddy just dreadfully. And it turned out, of course, we knew the man. He was quite a close neighbor of ours. And he only had the one little daughter. I think she was about 7 or 8 when he died. And John Shaw had killed him. And by you know, life is just so full of these strange circular coincidences. When I went to the bar and was practicing at the bar, one of the first cases I was given involved going down to the cells where these young men who were young loyalist assassins, essentially, were being held on a bail application. And when I went in, I discovered one of them was John. So I had to recuse myself. He didn't want me to do it anyway. And but he admitted to all the killings. And the only one that he expressed regret for was the good Christian man that he had killed. And I said to him, in the name of God, John, but sure, you live beside us as Catholics. And he said, yeah, but you're not like them. And I said, well, the only difference is that you know us. Anyway, I didn't do his bail application. And sad to say, the impact on his parents of what he did was appalling. It just ruined their lives. Many years later, that little girl whose father had been murdered on that day, and my cousin had gone to help him, she went to the historical inquiries team, the members of the police force in Northern Ireland, to see could she find out anything about her father's death, because it had never been discussed. Her mother had early onset Alzheimer's, God help her. She was raised by relatives and they never wanted to talk about it. And in the file, she found a reference to me, because some years later, when I was doing a radio broadcast and I was asked about deaths that had, particularly just grabbed me in some way, or really, spoke to me in some way, I had mentioned him because I remembered him very well. He walked past our house on the way to and from work, and I had mentioned him. And so I was president by then, and she came to the Aris, lovely lady with her husband, and told me her story. And I then said, look, I think I should tell you about my cousin Paddy, because he went to his grave with this sense of, questioning, had he done right that day? Would the family think it was an awful, disrespectful thing for a Catholic to have said this Catholic prayer? And when I told her what he had done, she just started to cry. And she told me that she was delighted that somebody had helped to prepare her father for entry into heaven.
And that he didn't die alone.
And importantly, that he hadn't died alone, and that he had died with somebody who was trying very hard to care for him.
You create there are many stories, many threads, and together they create this sense of Northern Ireland as a very a place whose violence is extremely intimate, in the sense that people, it isn't strangers doing it to strangers. People are very closely entwined. I mean, the Shaw case that you refer to was your second case at the bar when you became a barrister. Your previous case, I'll just mention en passant, was somebody you also knew very well, because he'd attacked your house. And
he'd attacked my house. My brother went to school with his brother.
Yeah.
My brother, one of my brothers, my 5 brothers, is profoundly deaf. And he had been at school with this young man who also was in and out of our house quite a lot. They just lived round the back of us. And his brother obviously had joined a very, very seriously evil loyalist paramilitary organization. And first they came and they gathered at our corner one night, and they broke up paving stones and put them through our windows and frightened the wits out of us, because it was only my mother there with the children. My dad was at work in the pub on the Falls Road. And even at that, my father had found it very hard to get home in the evenings. It was just too dangerous crossing town. There was a lot of sectarian stuff going on. And so that night, we were petrified. We were terrified. And, the police were only like 5 or 6 minutes away, and we phoned them, but they didn't come. The attack happened about 10 o'clock at night, but they didn't come till 2 o'clock in the morning. And there was a woman, with 9 children. The youngest was only, a very tiny baby. And I was the oldest. And we were literally frightened out of our skins now. I remember for the first part of that attack, I literally was rooted to the spot. I couldn't move. And the people who did move, my sister Nora, who's younger than me, she took control. My younger brother Damien, a lot younger than me, he took control. They were so good. The younger ones in the family, seemed to be so tutored in the way of coping with crisis. And I was rooted to the spot now because I knew this could get really nasty. But anyway, we were fortunate enough in one respect, because although the police didn't come that night, a white car turned up outside slowly, came into view, and it was far, we could see the car, but we couldn't see what the people in it were doing or saying to the crowd that was gathered, this throng of rioters, essentially. And we didn't know for quite some time. That car, the crowd scattered, and they didn't come back, they didn't reform, but that car kept circling. And to be honest, we initially thought that the whole point of the riot had been to get our father to come home early from work so they could kill him. And we thought that that car was connected to the plan to kill my father. Anyway, it turned out that it wasn't, that the IRA had been listening in on the police radio, and that they had sent out their own squad car to get rid of the crowd, the rioters, and to make sure they didn't come back, and that we would be safe. So, you know, that's our doing.
When you include a poem in the book which talks about your awareness of what it's like to live in an oppressive sectarian atmosphere, and in the last stanza you talk about your eyeless back sort of prickling with life because you know that you're being watched. You're being watched because you're the other. Or
because you're the other, because you're Catholic, because you're school uniform.
How old were you when you became aware of that, and how did you cope with that?
I probably was very young when I became aware of that. I mean, because I started going to the park, the local Woodvale Park, not exactly on my own, but with my friends, particularly with our Protestant friends. In fact, only with our Protestant friends. I was very aware that we were the other. Even in our street, we were aware that we were the other, because we were the first Catholic family in the particular street that we lived in then, which was just slightly above the Woodvale Road at that time, a place called Mountain View Gardens. And there were neighbours there who wouldn't allow their children to play with us because we were Catholics. But they were exceptional. The rest of the neighbours were all very welcoming and kind and good to us, and we made friends for life there. So I was aware of our otherness there, very definitely. I mean, when we moved into the place, I was only a little toddler when we moved in, but my father tells the story, or God rest him, of when we moved in. It must have been summertime, because we were only in 5 minutes when somebody stuck red, white, and blue bunting and a Union Jack across our gable. And my father, of course, went out and took it down. And the next thing, it was put back up again. And one of our neighbours on the other side came into my father and said, a Protestant neighbour came in and said, "Look, Paddy, we had nothing to do with that. That's not us." And the neighbours on the other side, who are also a Protestant family, who despised anything to do with the Orange Order, they were a very, very, we would call good living Christian family, and they had nothing whatsoever. They absolutely had no time for the Orange Order. We went on holidays with them year in, year out, so. But nonetheless, you were aware of being different. And then when we went, particularly when as a child I went to the park with my friend Florence, if we didn't have her with us, we wouldn't have been able to go, because she kept an eye out for us. We wouldn't be there long when the first time I heard the word Fenian was in that park. So you wouldn't be there a few minutes when somebody would point you out as a Fenian and somebody would try to be provocative. But they were dealing with a Rottweiler with Florence. And I always think she was so courageous. I mean, she took them on. She flattened people on our account. And these were people that she was at school with. You know, she had to go and face them in the schoolyard the next day, but no bother to her. So I was aware. I was always, it was always there. It was in the ether. Even in the shops, we knew that there were some shops where you'd get a smile and some shops where you wouldn't. You'd be almost snarled at,
I mean, it's very interesting because it's something that people from outside, I mean, I live in Northern Ireland, don't find difficult to understand. And also, it's something that people prefer to disallow. Yes. There's a very, very strong feeling nowadays that there was a bit of occasional bad apples getting up to malarkey, kind of like over there. But everything was grand, whereas in fact, on an epic scale, it was anything but grand.
You're right. Yeah, you're so right.
I wonder whether why. So reading this book, and it's a fascinating book. I thought, was this connected to why you then decided to study the law and become a barrister in Northern Ireland? And I was also curious, why didn't you go to Dublin?
Well, I would have if I hadn't been the oldest of 9 children, Carlo, and my parents didn't have the money. I got into Trinity. I was accepted into Trinity, and I had to get the letter, from the bishop to say, or the archbishop to say I could go, and we had done all that. But realistically, my parents would never have been able to afford. There are 8 kids coming behind me, and so that it really wasn't a runner. Plus, of course, Queen's University in Belfast had a really, really good law faculty. And I'd got in there. So why wouldn't I go there when it was on the doorstep? And that's what I did. I went to my local university and never regretted that. But the reason why I studied law, I've often kind of tossed this around in my mind. But among the heroes that I grew up with, and there were a few, my father had left school at 14, but he was very well read and very interested in Irish history, ferociously interested in Irish history. And he introduced me as a youngster to Daniel O'Connell and the story of Daniel O'Connell, that Daniel became a lawyer, really by the grace of God. The penal laws which had prevented Catholics from being lawyers changed just in time to allow him to become a lawyer. And then he goes on to Parliament. And then he goes to France, and he's there at the time of the French Revolution, and the violence frightens him permanently. He sees that once the genie of violence is out of the bottle, it doesn't matter how righteous your cause, once that violence is out of the bottle, you cannot get it back in again. And he sees the downstream consequences, like lava flowing down a mountain, like red hot lava, taking everything in its path. And it appalls him. And it changes something in him. Something actually in him solidifies around a determination that you can use the law, you can use Parliament, you can use persuasion, you can use the monster rallies, you can use the power of the people, but you don't use violence, because that just gives your enemy, that lowers you to the same level as your enemy. And so that's what I grew up with. I grew up with the story of Dan O'Connell. He was my hero. Another hero was St. Thomas More, who was the king's good servant, but God's first. So there was that. There was the mix of the law and the power of the law and the power of persuasion through words and ideas. Mm-hmm. And there was then the power of faith. And the faith that I had and that was given, that I grew up with, was people would call it now very simple faith, and it was. But it was focused on, peace on earth, goodwill to all men. It was focused on love your neighbor. And that's what I absorbed from it. I know that there was acres of canon law and doctrine and teaching that later made its inroads and was already making its inroads into my parents' life, having 11 children that, if they had grown in another generation, they most certainly would not have had. But as I was growing up, it was the idealism of peace on earth and the story of the nativity and the beauty of that. And I loved the music. I loved the soaring beauty of church music and the soaring beauty of the poetry around church music. And that just appealed to an aesthetic in me that really was not, that violence never appealed to. I just thought, violence is just so dull and so utterly bereft of logic, because I was born in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. God knows if any generation should have known the complete valuelessness of killing people, because Europe was just a big bloodbath in the generation immediately before mine and in the decade before I was born. It should have been that generation. So that's, I think, how I became wedded to the notion of law and the notion of not seeking in violence an answer to anything.
So you become a I mean, I'm going to say, it's going to sound very glib. You become a barrister just like that. No, not just like that.
Well, 5 years of study later.
An enormous amount of work. And then this, the things that happen as one moves into adulthood happen. One marries, one has children, you go to Dublin, you start working at Trinity, you become a reporter or a contributor, you're involved in RTE, and that gives you, you see what they think about people from Northern Ireland in the Republic, and you also see Northern Ireland as they see it. It gives you gives you some new lenses.
Yes, that's true, and it's disappointing. It was very disappointing to realise, in Dublin, how easily you were stereotyped. I mean, in the north, you're stereotyped as a Catholic. In the Catholic Church, you're stereotyped as a woman. When I came to Dublin, you were stereotyped as a Northern Catholic woman. So, yes, these were all great life lessons, Carlo. Every one of them, that you just had to adapt to, because between leaving school, going to university, becoming a barrister, and going to Trinity, I would say, not just me, but my family had experienced some of the most convulsive suffering and violence imaginable, and so I was carrying all that with me.
Well, just describe some of those things that happened.
Well, my brother John, I mentioned John's profoundly deaf. A group of young loyalists stabbed him outside our front door one night when he was coming home from the death club. They lay in wait for him, and they broke a bottle over his head and then slashed his face and stabbed him. Tried to kill him. Actually, tried to sever his artery. They severed an artery, but not thank God, one that eventually. But he was bleeding badly when we found him, but the hospital was only a very short journey away, so they saved his life, thank God. So that was sectarian. And we knew the young man who did it, who was the leader of the gang. We didn't know all of them, but we knew one of them, the one who was the leader of the gang, again, the neighbour's child, father very high up in the Orange Order, and nothing happened. There was no prosecution. Regrettably, that young man went on to commit the actual murder of a Catholic bank manager, not far from us. So the young police officer who had looked after my brother said to me subsequently, what a pity we didn't prosecute that young man then, that that bank manager might still be alive if they had done that. But anyway, that was Northern Ireland at that time. So there was that, and then there was, my father had he had a pub and a half. He had a pub on the Falls Road, just off the Falls Road, and loyalists left a car bomb outside of it, it exploded, killing a young girl, a young woman, whom I didn't know her, but I knew her brother. Her brother was a friend of mine. She was a young married woman with children, and she died in that explosion. My father suffered from catatonic depression after her death. He ran out onto the street. He had actually got all his clients, all his customers, he'd managed to get them all safely. The pub was called the Long Bar because it stretched across two streets, so it had a back door in another street. So he got them all out the back door, but went to the front just to check and make sure there was nobody left. And as he did that, the bomb exploded. He was fortunate. He was safe, and nothing happened to him, except that he saw her fall. She ran across the street searching for her child, who actually, as it turned out, was safe. But anyway, he grabbed her, but she was already dead, apparently. We were told that the keys of the car had broken her neck, and my father thought she had just fainted because there was no blood. She wasn't, she looked perfect. And it was an RTE cameraman who was one of the first on the scene who told me that he knew then that my father probably was not going to be right mentally for quite some time, because he was the person who had to break it to him that the girl that he was holding and who he thought was just, was about to come around and had just fainted, he was the person who said, that she was dead. So that was then. Then the other pub, rather ecumenically, which he owned a half share in, along with a man called Tommy Hunt. Tommy was a fellow Roscommon man. He and his brother Paddy were terribly well-known businessmen in Belfast. You probably know some of their family, the famous Hunt girls, who are great musicians. They would have been nieces of Tommy's. And the IRA set fire to that place. Well, actually left a bomb in it. The bomb went off, set the place on fire. And so he lost that as well. So we were left. And then, of course, the man who had been the orchestrator of the riot outside our home, and who, again, who was not prosecuted, he came another night. He was with a colleague, member of a loyalist gang, and they had, between them, they had 2 machine guns, and they emptied the contents of the machine guns into our home. So we never stood in that home again. That was the last time we ever stood in it. When my father went back the next day to try and retrieve, bits and pieces, mainly clothes and things, really, a sniper shot at him, luckily missed him. So we never went back to that place again. And the sniper, anyway, he was in the house. He had gone back into the house. The police were actually at the door, and the army helping him, as he thought, to get into the house to rescue a few bits and pieces. When they came to him and said, "You got to get out of here. There's somebody trying to shoot you." And he got back into his car, and a policeman walked over and said to him, "Do you realize your tax is your car tax is a week or a fortnight out of date?" Mm. And that was all that ever happened. That particular man who tried to kill my entire family that night, but managed not to kill anybody, because they were or that day, that they were so ignorant of the fact that my family were all out at first mass. It was the morning of the 8th of December, and they clearly knew nothing about Catholic customs, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. They were all out at first mass when they came back. The little fellow Clem, whom you know, he was only a baby then, my brother Clement. Clement was only 3 or 4, and he was running around the garden picking up the spent cartridges. With the delight of a child at finding something so, exotic in the front garden, not realizing that this was designed to kill him. My sister Nora's bed, I can only describe it as a colander. That's all I could describe it as. Just awful. So those were the kind of things that were going on. That young man whom we knew, I actually defended him in court, funnily enough, as a barrister. Another one of life's strange coincidences. Pascal O'Hare, God rest him, great Belfast solicitor, gave me this case. And when I went over to the petty sessions to see who my client was and saw who it was, I nearly had a heart attack, because it was the guy who had intimidated us with that gang that night. And he'd also done exactly the same thing to another Catholic family. And that Catholic family happened to have a member of their family was a senior police officer. And he came to the door and he discharged his weapon. That's how he got rid of them. They did the same thing with him, with his family throwing bricks and paving stones through their window. But he came and he scattered them with his gun. And I had to stand in court and put it to him that he couldn't possibly have recognized the man who did to him what he did to me. And what he said in front of the judge was, "Sure, Mary, you know him as well as I do." So, right. And that was my first appearance in the petty sessions. And the tradition is that you're welcome, that the senior solicitor welcomes you, the judge welcomes you, the police officer. So I've gone through this whole palaver. And the only person who seemed to know where they were actually at in the court, of the two of us, my client and I, my client looked like he was a man who was really at home there, which I guess he was. It was my first case. I didn't even know where to sit. I was petrified. And only for the senior solicitor sort of taking me in hand and saying, "Sit here, you'll be fine." And then the judge was the father of an old friend of mine, Charlie Stewart. His daughter Paula and I were best pals at school. And he was welcoming me. And then I had to stand up and defend this lunatic, and who of course was pleading not guilty, needless to remark. And when the police officer in the witness box said, "Sure, Mary, you know him as well as I do," Charlie Stewart nearly had a heart attack too. And I said, "What's going on here?" So we had to keep the whole thing calm. And then Charlie at the end, God love him, said, "Well, that I had made such a really good job of my first case that he gave him 6 months and he suspended it." I was devastated because I knew my mother and father would be also devastated. And the story appeared in the front page of the Belfast Telegraph, I think it was. And when I rang home that evening to tell my parents, they'd got the evening paper, and my mother said, "Don't come home anytime soon." She said, "Your father wants to know, is this what we educated you for?" But that man went on then. He was subsequently killed, murdered himself by one of his own henchmen in an internecine feud among loyalists. So that's how he died. He died a very violent death.
All sorts of things happen to you. You flourish. You have a marriage. You have children, and you decide to enter, you decide to enter the Irish presidential race some years later. And then what happens to you subsequently links back to these things that we've been talking about. But what made you decide, when Mary Robinson indicated she was going to retire early, that this is what you would do, that you would seek the nomination?
Well, remember, it was 1997. So it was before the Good Friday Agreement. And I had for some time before that, for many, many years before that, I had been involved in interchurch talks, in reconciliation efforts. That's what I had been the co-author of a report that was commissioned by the Protestant Catholic churches on sectarianism. Produced one of the best documents, I think, of the Troubles, analysing where the Troubles originated and how all of us could move beyond them. And so I had spent a lot of time, and a lot of my life was involved in those issues. But in particular, and unknown to everybody except my husband, John Hume, Gerry Adams, and Father Alex Reid, and the head of the Redemptorist order, I had been one of, and a man called Jim Fitzpatrick, the head of the Irish News, and a newspaper that you know well in Northern Ireland. I had been part of what is called the Redemptorist Peace Ministry, where they hosted the talks between Gerry Adams and John Hume, which were designed to try and get the IRA to accept that the war was over. And that if they wanted to achieve anything, they would never achieve it by continuing violence, and in particular inflicting violence upon the very people that you were going to have to persuade sometime if you thought it was, if you wanted a united Ireland, these were the very people you'd have to persuade. To visit continuing violence on them was simply unacceptable, and also completely ineffective. So it was Father Alec Reid who had come up with this idea a number of years earlier of the Hume Adams talks, and they went through a number of permutations. But John Hume, the whole point of them was that John Hume was conveying to Gerry Adams the language, the thinking, the structure, the analysis that characterized Hume and now characterizes the Good Friday Agreement, and giving him the language and the tools and a sense, in many ways, the passion to go back and persuade the IRA that there was a way beyond violence, but it led to democratic politics. And that was the path they were going to have to embrace if their ambition for United Ireland was ever to have a future. And so there was huge hostility to those talks. They were private talks, but of course, like everything else, there were leaks, and there were and from time to time, Gerry Adams and John Hume would make statements that were designed to try and nudge the IRA away from violence and into the political arena. The solely political arena. And anyway, John Hume had been my hero since I was 13, since I first heard him speak in Ardoyne Hall, not about the Troubles at all, because this was before the onset of the Troubles, but he talked about the power of the halfpennies and pennies of the poor. He came to my parish to talk about the credit union movement, which I'd never heard of until then, but became a huge fan of that very day and that night. Listening to him, he just revolutionized my thinking. And so I was always an acolyte, a quiet in the background acolyte of John Hume's. He, for me, is the most outstanding and most significant figure in Irish history of my lifetime. And so I could see and knew from Father Alex, a friend of mine, I knew of the impact that the stress that was being put on John by, he was not being backed by members of his party. He was obviously not being backed by unionists. He was being harangued and harassed by certain sections of the media. And, it was taking its toll. He's only human after all. And so when the talks were reconstituted in I think their second iteration after the Canary Wharf bomb, the Redemptorists, who were the hosts for what's called their peace ministry, these talks were hosted in Clonard Monastery, where they also incidentally hosted talks with loyalists. I wasn't privy to those, and at least I wasn't part of them. And so I was part of this little group that the Redemptorists and Father Alec thought would be useful. There only were two of us in the group. That was Jim Fitzpatrick and myself. We were in the room when John Hume and Gerry Adams were talking and thinking aloud and planning and trying to see how we could all get beyond the violence. We were there, and our job for Jim and I was to try and go out to John's colleagues, go out to key influencers in the media, people who had been giving John a hard time, and to try and explain to them that this was miraculous. This was exactly what needed to happen. We were going to get nowhere if the violence continued, and we needed something and somebody to persuade them to stop the violence. On both sides, on the loyalists and on the IRA side. Well, John Hume and Gerry Adams between them had the makings of an idea and that could persuade the IRA to go on ceasefire and, importantly, to enter the democratic process. And so we went around and spoke to, that was our job. Now, so that I had done that in the summer, and in the summer, the winter, the summer before that, before 1997. So I was consumed by John's vision for the future and his analysis of the Troubles. I mean, nobody has ever bettered it. And also, I was very involved in, was very involved also in the writing up the sectarianism report. And then I had been asked by the World Christian Meditation Community to run a series of seminars. The year before, the series of seminars had been given by the Dalai Lama. I was very privileged to be asked to give them in the summer of 1997, as a result of which I wrote a book on reconciliation. So, if you like, when the summer of 1997 came, that was my whole hinterland. It was all about peace, it was about reconciliation. But also it was about new ideas as to how we could deliver that. And so when Mary Robinson decided when President Robinson decided that she was not going to stay on, I have to say my first thought and the first two words out of my mouth were John Hume. I thought it was going to be John Hume. And I thought that it was, for me, it seemed so obvious that this was the moment when we were pushing toward the peace process, and I could see John, with his vision. I thought the presidency would be ideal. As it turned out, Father Alec went to him and talked to him, and John said no, that he was not going to run for the presidency, that he had to stay where he was, that bear in mind that we were a year away from the Good Friday Agreement, and that there was still so much work to be done in Northern Ireland that he simply could not, he couldn't extricate himself from it then. It was too dangerous to do that. It could fall apart. I understood that, but I also understood somebody has to fill that gap with that vision, with that passion, with that mission, the mission of building bridges to one another. And so when Father Alex, he was among one of my great friends, Harry Casey, came in, he said, well, if it's not going to be John Hume, then he said, you've got to think about it. It has to be you. And so I did. And my husband said the same thing to me. Father Alex said the same thing. And that's how, if you like, the snowball started to gather, and I began to realize that my life's experience to that point gave me the makings of a very important and timely mission.
You became the president of a polity of a country where you didn't have a vote, which strikes me as well, worth remarking on. And then you, in your terms, really, you did all sorts of things, but in my opinion, for me, the most interesting was the engagement with loyalism.
Yes.
Boy, did you and your husband engage indefatigably. Now, partly that was to do with what you alluded to earlier, which was the report on sectarianism that you wrote. You had a deep understanding. Just tell us sort of quickly what conclusions had that report come to, and what then did you see as what were you hoping to achieve in your engagement with Jackie MacDonald and particularly the UDA?
The simplest way of putting it is that we could live, Catholics and Protestants were living in Northern Ireland cheek by jowl in mystifying ignorance of one another, dangerous ignorance of one another, full of passion about each other, that could quickly turn toxic. And part of the difficulty was that you could live so close to people and be in their orbit, live in the next street, up the street, down the street, and still be so dangerously ignorant of one another that when along comes a firebrand like the Reverend Ian Paisley, who stirred up the sectarian tensions, which were always there, incidentally. They existed in every generation. And if you look at the history of our Down, the pogroms go back for 100 years. So the embers had never been put out, Carlo. They had never been quenched. They were always just waiting to be stirred up. And I felt the best thing we could do, because there was such fear of the Republic, fear of the Trojan horse of United Ireland, fear of Catholics. I lived with it. I mean, I grew up on those streets. Martin too. Martin, he grew up in a loyalist area. We weren't frightened of these people. We weren't frightened of them. They were our friends and neighbors, some of them. Some of them were our tormentors. And what my view was, they're always going to be our neighbors, always going to be our neighbors. Would it not be better if we put our minds to being the best neighbors we could be? And the only way we're going to be able to do that is to offer hospitality without evangelizing, without proselytizing, because honestly, as you know, in Northern Ireland, our history is that that both traditions in Northern Ireland are strongly evangelical, strongly proselytizing. I'll be your friend. The idea of, you'll have the pet Protestant friend or the pet Catholic friend. Why? Because that person, you're hoping to turn them into a version of yourself, which is so disrespectful of the very otherness of the other. So what we wanted to do was to start, in a sense, from a blank sheet of paper and simply befriend, build up a culture of good neighborliness, so that when we got around to dealing with the tough questions, the really tough questions, that there would be that what you call it, kind of like a cushion of goodwill that would simply have been developed around people being invited and, importantly, being courageous enough to accept the invitation. So that's what we set our minds to do. Now, bear in mind, Martin and I both grew up in Protestant areas. We've both been to Queen's University. We had a lot of Protestant friends from Queen's. So a lot of those people gathered round us and helped hugely. And many of our friends who, I think particularly of Dennis Maloney, who was a lawyer, working both with loyalists and loyalist paramilitaries and Republican paramilitaries, they just went out, they made the phone calls, they made the connections. I think of Colonel Harvey Bicker, who was a very, very senior member of the Ulster Unionist Party, former colonel in the British Army, former member of the UDR. And before I was even elected, he wrote to me and he said, I think you're going to be elected. And if you are, I'm going to work with you because I firmly believe in the Building Bridges project. And he did. Day one, there he was and stayed with us, right through the 14 years, did phenomenal work. and was very helpful to me, particularly in relation to things like the understanding of the 36th Ulster Division and its role in the First World War among Ulster Unionists. I had grown up with that. I knew it was there, but it wasn't really a big part of my sense of identity. But I knew it meant a lot to them. And he was the person who really, really helped me to understand that. Also, one of my colleagues, or a couple of my colleagues from Trinity College, who were experts in this whole area. And so with that, we knew that there were pockets of history that we had, because everything is so divided, everything is thus, us, them. We had divided history in a way that flattered, a divided history and a divided country and divided people. And sometimes we didn't tell the truth about history. And if we had told the truth about it, we would discover that we weren't as divided after all. And the First World War was an obvious one, a very obvious one. And so we set to work on with those, and there were quite a number of people working, in this, people like Paddy Hart and Glenn Barr, who were already working in this field. And we joined forces with them, as it were. And then, of course, in 1998, I went to Messines with the Queen, where we had that wonderful opening of the Round Tower, dedicated not just to the 36th Ulster, though it is, of course, but also, to the 16th Irish, to the 10th, to the 200,000 men, mostly volunteers from the island of Ireland, most of them nationalists, most of them Catholics, whose stories got stuck in shoeboxes in attic because it didn't fit with the story of the rising and the heroes of the rising, and the fact that they fought in British uniform. All of that mix that became skewed. We tried to help those who were helping to straighten it out, and actually, I think that was one of the great things that unlocked a lot of the kind of yesness that was in people that just couldn't find a way out, the decency that was in them, the desire to get to know each other better. Anyway, most importantly, it gave us a platform that we could all talk on and share, and not feel cut off from each other, and that was good. So, look, when Martin and I went into the Áras, we were fortunate that we just had a mission, and we just got on with it. And he sat on the phone. He gave up his job. He gave up his practice. That he'd worked so hard to get, because he didn't become a dentist. He went back to dentistry at 30 years of age, and and went back to full-time study, and had helped to build up the practice along with his partner Des Casey, and was doing grand and doing great in Bessbrook and Crossmaglen. One of his nurses, very sadly, Sandra, fabulous girl from Bessbrook. Her daddy was murdered in the Kingsmill massacres. Young Protestant man from Bessbrook. This is how your life gets wound into the lives of other great people, and the goodness, and the decency, and the kindness that's in them, and you also know the barriers and the fears that people have. And so we just decided to make the Áras a place where you could come and have a cup of tea. There would be no camera on you. We weren't looking for pictures, because you could get very cynical, around things like just spin and photographs just for the spin of the day, photo ops. We wanted to really build relationships, and that's what we started to do. And people, little by little, they started to come, and Martin sat on the phone just phoning people, day after day after day. Please come, cup of tea, lunch, chat, no hard talk, hard talk.
I mean, this
simple friendship.
This business of how things are wound together. Right at the very beginning of the conversation, I was talking about your neighbours, the Shaws, and then I mentioned the O'Reillys. And just one of the facts that is threaded into the book is that Tony and Miles O'Reilly, who you knew very well when you lived in Ardoyne, were murdered on the day you got married.
Yes. I idolized them.
There is something else. You talk about people having flattering histories that flatter themselves. You say in this book some, we could say, unflattering things about your own tradition and your own church. Your rebukes are quite fierce, I would say. And I think that must surely also have been at play when you were during those 14 years, when you were building bridges, when you were communicating and trying to bring people together. Because I'm sure that was recognized.
Well, I think, can I put it this way? I grew up in a place where Catholics were undoubtedly the underdogs and the second-class citizens. Of that, there is no doubt. They were treated appallingly by the Protestant establishment, appallingly. And, you know, unionism was no friend to Catholics in Northern Ireland.
Most definitely not.
So, but that said, in another sphere altogether, I was a woman growing up in the Catholic Church, and the church was migrating from the days of the old Empire Church through the Vatican Council. I was a teenager when the Vatican Council started. We were also migrating towards membership of the European Union, towards women's rights. So things were, and most importantly, of course, probably most important of all, I belong to that generation that benefited from free education and the massification of third-level education. My mum left school at 15, my dad at 14. That was the end of their education, essentially, their formal education. And they didn't have the money to go to fancy schools. But I, on the other hand, grew up after the Butler Act had come in Northern Ireland. And so my father was one of a group of young men. He belonged to the Knights of Columbanus. They got organized. They went to the bishop. They asked for the schools, the Pritchard brothers to grow the schools, for the Mercy nuns to grow the schools, so that this great opportunity, my father could just see, he would so love to have had a decent education, and my mum too. They could see this was the hope for their children, and they weren't pushy parents in that sense at all, but they just knew this was the chance. So I took that chance. I was very fortunate to have that chance. In the Republic, that chance came a bit later, Carlo. It was the best part of 20 years later. The Butler Acts were the end of the 40s. Free second-level education in the Republic was the end of the 60s. So, so I'm growing up through the Humanae Vitae. It was 1968. I was still a schoolgirl. We discussed it in school. We had debates about it in school. It was a time, and I was with the Dominican nuns who were really very encouraging of us to think of ourselves as young professional women, and as women who could have a voice. They weren't trying to turn us all into mad modern feminists, now don't get me wrong, but nonetheless, they were willing to listen and to encourage debate. And so I was fortunate. I think a generation earlier, I would have been, I'd probably, got married and had 9 kids like my mother, who was very much, she was, and my father too, they were very faithful to the church because the church told them they had to be. They had to be obedient, that by virtue of their baptism, they had taken on obligations, even though they were only like days old. They had taken on obligations that you could never, ever, ever walk away from. And you had to obey the magisterium. Why? Because the magisterium was always right. Well, actually, as I was growing up and developing the kind of critical skills that a good education is supposed to give you, I kind of figured that some of this stuff, wasn't just as infallible and as credible as they might have wished. And of course, we were taught nothing about church history, nothing whatsoever. It was all the lives of the saints, all the hagiographies. So the bad stuff, we never learned about. Like, we never learned that Pius IX kidnapped Jewish children. God almighty. We never learned how anti-Semitic the church was, and how that thinking clouded the 20th century of Europe eventually, and played its part in carrying the toxin, the poison of anti-Semitism. We were never taught to critique. We were taught to be obedient, you see. And somewhere along the line, I tried being obedient, don't get me wrong. I look back now in horror at some of the things that I was obedient to, and I'm mortified. But over time, I realized thankfully, I was also born in the wake of probably the most important document of any century, and that is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which told me that I was equal to everybody, not better than anybody, but equal to everybody, and that I had the right to freedom of expression, freedom of opinion, freedom of belief, freedom of religion, and freedom to change religion. Now, in the Catholic Church, you don't have any of those freedoms. Every one of them by baptism is circumscribed. Your freedom of belief is taken away from you. It's circumscribed to the extent that you're told that in relation to matters of faith and morals, your beliefs have to be obedient to what the magisterium teaches. Conscience has to be informed by the magisterium. Once you're born a Catholic, you're a Catholic forever. Many people don't understand, for example, that excommunication doesn't mean that you're thrown out of the church. It merely means that you're a member in bad standing. And so the church doesn't recognize your right to leave and to walk away. In fact, it regards this as very serious penal offenses in the church. You know, that if you apostatize or you commit heresy or schismatic. I only grew in because I'm interested in law, basically, you know, and I'm interested in structure. I started to be interested in the teaching of my church, and I started to investigate it. The first thing I discovered, of course, is how ridiculously, dreadfully, badly it treats women, even to this very moment. And then, of course, in the 1970s, I became involved in gay rights as founder member of the campaign for what was then homosexual law reform. Carlo, God help us. I mean, it was to get rid of the criminalization of homosexual acts. Imagine. And back in the mid 1970s, I was a co-founder of the campaign to get rid of that, and along with David Norris and a group of other people who were fantastic, and who succeeded in going all the way to the European courts. To have that law struck down. And so growing in consciousness about human rights, I began to realize my church was no champion of human rights either, you know, and that's hard for Catholics in the North to acknowledge, because it very often for many of us, it was our faith and it was the routine and the ritual and the community solidarity, you know, around our identity as Catholics that kept us going through the bigotry, that tsunami of bigotry that we faced as Catholics in Northern Ireland. And there's always in that, isn't there, a resistance to the idea of turning on your own and admitting, you know, turning the camera round the other way, or the spotlight, and critiquing yourself internally. And of course, the Catholic Church has no history whatsoever, apart from the Second Vatican Council. It has no real history of self-critiquing. It has an anti-self-critiquing culture, if the truth be told. It's more used to standing on the great, you know, pulpit of the world and preaching out to the world and telling the world what it's doing wrong, you know, and everything from climate change to migrants to back in the day, you know, church, you think of Pius IX, you know, who and his syllabus of errors, that long list of things that were wrong with the world. And God wanted the world to be not only a Catholic world, entirely Catholic, but wanted the Pope to be the emperor of that whole world. And, you know, all this nonsense. And I came to that as a searcher for the real story rather than the hagiography.
Because when you finished your second term as president, you then, well, it wasn't easy, but you became a doctor of canon law.
Yes, I went to Rome.
Yeah, which is a formidable achievement. And you had to do your viva in Italian.
Yes.
Oh my goodness me! I mean, this is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do, and this is part of the process by which you're going to work for self-reflection within the church.
Yes, this is where I've placed myself. I mean, I'm retired now, obviously, you know, from public office and from, though I still do a little bit of work. I mean, I'm a part-time teacher of children, religion and law in the University of Glasgow. And since I left office, I have also, you know, done semesters teaching this particular course, which is about the rights of the child, and the in particular the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which incidentally, the Holy See is a state party to. And that's what interests me, because here is the Holy See saying that it agrees that children should have, by virtue simply of being human, the right to freedom of information, freedom of the fullest education, not just filtered or heavily edited education, but the kind of education that helps them to make up their own minds, because they have freedom of conscience, freedom of opinion, freedom of belief. And there's the church signs up to that, but doesn't do terribly much, it seems to me, to respect it in its teachings. So that's where I placed myself. I went to Rome I left office in late 2011, and by 3 months later, I was installed living in Rome in the Pontifical Gregorian University. And I had decided that in order to be able to talk about these things, I had to have academic credibility. I couldn't just be, I had to have the information, I had to have the credibility, I had to have the piece of paper, if you like. So I qualified as a canon lawyer. I already had a master's degree in canon law, incidentally, long before I left the Irish. And I had a master's degree in canon law. And so I took that with me to Rome. And then I became what's called a licentiate in canon law. That's kind of like becoming, that's the professional qualification. You're now a canon lawyer with that. And then, and I did all that through Italian and Latin. And so then I thought, well, I'll stay on and I'll do a doctorate. So that by now I was really fascinated by the whole area of children's rights and canon law and how overlooked they were and how important. I mean, the church has 400 million child members worldwide. It's one of the most important key influencers in the world. And sometimes in our secularized kind of world, we tend to forget how important faith is to people. Like 5 out of 7 people in the world believe in some faith or other. I was just looking at Joe Biden today, that miracle, thank God, of the return to democracy in the United States. And the vast majority, just take a look at who's in his cabinet and who he surrounds himself with. 1/3 of the people working with him are from Jewish backgrounds. Another 1/3 are from Irish backgrounds. About half of them are from Catholic backgrounds. They are people of faith. Now, they're not people of ultra-conservative, orthodox, right-wing faith. They're people who are thinking faith people. People for whom faith matters because it introduces them to the idea of human dignity and human equality and opens them up to the human person. You're never going to hear from them things that are racist or sexist or anti-Muslim or, and you look at all the women he has and you look at Kamala, and this is the faith that I subscribe to. And so for me, going to Rome, getting those qualifications, it set me on what I would call just the rest of my life work, basically. That's it.
And given the recent report into the mother and baby homes, yours is the kind of expertise which we need. Mary McAleese, you have been an incredible interviewee, fantastically lucid. Mary McAleese's book, Here's the Story, a memoir, can be purchased at all good bookshops, but please refer to the ICC website for further details. We're in partnership with No Alibis bookshop in Belfast. And on our website, you'll find information about how to get the book at No Alibis and further information about the ICC. If you go to Belfast, go to No Alibis. It's fabulous, an oasis of culture. Mary McAleese, thank you.
Oh, Carlo, it's been a pleasure talking to you. You're so easy to talk to. Thank you.